Thank you, Paige. Brian, everybody, welcome. Thanks for being here. This is an interesting class. I've been to about 4,000 HOA meetings now over the last 25 years, wrote a book about it. And one of the problems, concerns that I routinely see is this difficulty in messaging and getting acceptance of the need to increase reserves. And so we're going to talk about some of the lessons that Brian and I have learned. We'll talk about how this class originated, and it was a class that we were teaching, I think it was last summer. It was kind of a funny story, but it fits in with one of our examples, so I'll save that for later. Brian, did you want to say anything in the beginning here?
No, I think you've got it from here, David.
Awesome, thanks. So, of course, a disclaimer, educational use only, not legal advice. We are not psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists, just students of HOA meetings. So please, before you rush out and do something, talk to your legal counsel, talk to your manager, talk to your reserve study professional. In framing this issue right now, depending on where in the country you're located, you probably are seeing a turbulent period, right? Which is reasonably common. It's going to depend on the building cycles of your locality, right? Here in Colorado, we've had pretty marked boom and bust building cycles over the last 40, 50 years. And it's important to remember that if your community or your locality as a manager, if your properties, your portfolio are facing a lot of underfunded, deferred maintenance, it's a phase in the life cycle of any community. It's not forever, right? Community starts out new, developer in some cases, not in every case, keeps the assessments reasonably low because it helps home sales. Then we have years of peace, and with peace often comes apathy. And obviously real property and improvements on property decline with every passing moment and with every rainstorm. And then all of a sudden, those gradual changes, like children growing up that you don't notice, all of a sudden there's a problem. And then we have this awareness. We have to fix something. We have to make over our community. We have to replace the roofs. We have to do X, Y, and Z. And then we have this turbulent period where we're scrambling to educate homeowners about the need for additional money, explaining to the homeowners to the best of the current board's ability why previous boards may not have increased assessments for decades at a time. The money is raised one way or the other, depending on the urgency of the situation. And then we have relative peace again. So right now, for a number of our clients here, and from what I understand nationally, we're in this turbulent period where, a significant number of infrastructure components are 30, 40, 50 years old, and they weren't made to last forever. And I was at a reserve assessment increase meeting, and I was talking to someone from Egypt, and he was adamant that buildings should last 800 years because that's what happens in Egypt. Look at the pyramids. I said, well, that's not usually my experience with American-made dwelling units, and certainly not with most buildings that were built within the last 40 or 50 years. So it was an interesting conversation for sure. And so there's two overarching principles that I think are helpful to understand when we're trying to talk about changing the status quo. And if the status quo has been not, and I don't want to use the word aggressively, but not repeatedly raising assessments to keep pace with the repeated increases in the cost of living, then there's two hurdles that we often face. And one is classic sales. And I'm not saying we use this to sell, but it's used in sales all the time, which is anchoring, right? This car is worth $60,000, but if you drive it off the lot today, I'll give it to you for $39,900. And when you say the $60,000 value, you anchor the price in at what it's worth to illustrate the discount. Now, unfortunately, we kind of have the reverse situation in associations where we're saying, I know your assessments have been $150 a month for the last 20 years, but now they have to go to $450 a month. And that's a really difficult mental leap for people to make because their mental picture or their bias of what assessments should be set at is anchored in an unrealistic number. And this anchoring is just a mental shortcut, which is why I think $150 is good. And therefore, I'm going to resist it going to $450. And I'm using exaggerated examples to make the point. And that's a hard thing to overcome, but it can be done with re-anchoring, right? And sometimes we would, and I don't want to speak for Brian, but the re-anchoring would be, that's fine. If you don't want to raise your assessments to $450 a month, then there's a trade-off, which is we may have to do one or more special assessments. And that word is understandably scary, very stark and attention-getting. And we got to be careful, I think, in how we message that, because we don't want to create paranoia where people start lighting up the social media world, which they probably will anyway, with, visions of us being on the Titanic and sinking to the bottom of the ocean, going down with it, but as a way of re-anchoring the reality of what the assessments need to be. And for me, it's much better reference points. And I rely heavily on people like Brian to come into these meetings with his rented bulletproof vest to explain, listen, I know I don't have to pay the assessments. I know I don't live here, but as an outside professional, I can tell you that these numbers, your $150 a month assessment might have worked in 1977, but Gerald Ford is no longer your president. And I can't remember who was the president in 77 off the top of my head. So we need to create new numbers based on really good data. That's anchoring in a nutshell. And then there's path dependence, which is kind of similar, but it's not quite the same, because it's almost like a community's cultural identity, right? It's this structural inertia to change. We've always done it this way. We've always been underfunded. We've always kept assessments low. And it's really like changing identities. And it's not quite as easy as doing it just with new numbers to anchor reality too. It's more about a whole transition as we try to educate the homeowners of how we believe they should look at their community. And it's not just, doing everything on a shoestring at a last minute with the lowest bidder, because that often produces significant downstream consequences. But talking about, listen, we need to revitalize this community. We need to assure the residents that the roofs are not leaking. And this is kind of a sometimes multi-year campaign of saying, and we don't say it this way, but like, there's a new sheriff in town. We need to get a handle on this situation, and we all need to change the way we look at the value of the association, the importance of it, and the role that it plays in our lives, so that we can get past this structural inertia or identity of, no, we always do things on shoestring budgets. And so these are the specific problems we're going to talk about today after going through the big picture, not having a reserve study, having a homemade reserve study, having a reserve study or a belief that it's hard to interpret and too expensive, is the situation that Brian and I faced live, where homeowners yelled out, it's too expensive. Boards wanting to do understandably Band-Aids, this concept of losing to inflation. Perceived gift to owners is one of the more important ones that we'll talk about, which is this subtle shift of messaging, which is, we're not saving for the future. We are saving for the future, but it's not for the benefit of future people. It's you're paying as you go. And then we'll talk about the impact of under-reserved communities for resale ability. So why do we need a reserve study? Why do we need someone to tell us that we don't have enough money and they're too expensive and they're projections based upon guesses? That's what I hear people say at meetings. Brian?
Right. And so we've talked about this of re-anchoring the problem. We talked about the path dependence, a gradual path going towards the right destination. And so I have found, when we're talking about this and we receive this sort of pushback at a meeting, it can be intimidating. The reason why it's intimidating, if you're a board member or you're a manager, you just want things to run smoothly. But also you have a group of angry people yelling at you. It's no fun. We completely understand it. So how can we talk about this potentially emotional topic? Because we're talking about finances. Finances always become emotional. So how do we talk about the reserve study in a way that can create clarity? So I have found that a really good way to talk about the reserve study is that it's a map and it's a guideline. So when we're on a road trip, let's just say I want to take my kids to New York City or something like that. The first thing I need to know is where's my starting point, right? If I pull my map out or my GPS, where's my starting point? Now I need to know what my destination is. Okay. So I have those 2 points of reference. Now I can go on my trip. Now, do I throw my phone out the window because it's wrong? The GPS is wrong because I hit traffic and there's an accident and it was misleading me? Or do I go, let me recalibrate. Here's my new starting point. Is there a faster way around this detour, whatever it may be? Recalibrate. And then still I have the same destination. My destination didn't change. Okay, so that's a good analogy to think about the reserve study. The reserve study is a map and a guideline that tells us, first of all, where are we financially today? Where are our finances today? And then what's our destination? What's our goal? What's our trajectory? Okay, so when we frame that picture for our owners at our property, they go, okay, got it. Because what's our alternative? We could put our heads in the sand, but we don't even know where we're driving. We might be driving to Mexico, right? Like we need to make sure we're going in the right direction, first of all. So the reserve study, think of it as painting a more accurate picture of what is going on at your property. Okay, we think we have enough money. Well, relative to what? If you have liabilities or expenses for your association of over $1 million, but you have $500,000 in reserves, is that enough? Right? Like we have to look at the numbers first before we can actually make a conclusion. Additionally, when you're at that board meeting, it's helpful to put a reserve study up there because you might feel like you have a target on your back, but really rather you can just put the reserve study up and then you can move out of the way and say, well, here's the thing that's telling us what to do. Here's the thing that's informing us, right? And again, I want to actually clarify when I say tell you what you have to do. It's just telling you, here's the reality of what we're seeing or what we're facing at our association. This is what the costs are to replace a roof today. It's whatever, $200,000 or something like that, right? It could be quite expensive, but it's not you that's getting the target on the back. Rather, it's the reserve study telling the owners of the property, here is what it costs to live here. Here's the rate of deterioration or the cost of deterioration that we're experiencing on our property's components. And so now that allows your owners to say, okay, I'm upset, I'm frustrated, but I understand we have our roof to take care of. We have our siding to take care of. We have an asphalt to take care of. We have an elevator to take care of. Now they can hopefully calm down to understand that these costs are what they are. They can call a few vendors to price check if they want, but now they're actually making decisions on what to do moving forward, right? They're actually driving down the road now that they've seen the cost, now that they've seen what the true cost of ownership is. And we hope that this would then provide clarity and calmness. And then David, as far as minimizing lawsuits, what have you seen there when you have a reserve study versus when you don't have a reserve study?
Well, we'll talk about, hang on, let me just double check this. Yeah, I haven't seen a ton of lawsuits on reserve studies. You know, there's a lot of low-level grumbling about why did we get to this point? Who's to blame? You know, and it might have been a problem that has been 30 years in the making. So I haven't personally seen a ton of, well, I don't think I've even seen one of where the association was accused of not properly reserving, just because it's something that people, whether they admit it or not, they have access to the data. They have the ability to go to meetings. They have the ability in most states to look at the financial records of the association, and it's a shared responsibility. But to me, it's important. You said, you know, we talk about having the homeowners calm down. It's super important, I think, for the board to calm down as well, and to rely on the experts to make this pitch, which is really just an educational presentation. And it doesn't, you know, one of the problems I see in this situation where they get a reserve study, an association may not have had one for years, and they get it and they have this feeling of whiplash when they see what it shows. And it's like, okay, this is data about our community, and the homeowners ultimately make the decisions on funding. And if they don't make decisions on funding, they make decisions on who's elected to the board to make decisions on funding. And this is not just the board's problem. This is the community's problem or puzzle to solve with good data and hopefully collaborative information. And the stress of a board getting that whiplash-like reserve study sometimes causes board members to try to overcorrect, and the homeowners resist far more vigorously than is helpful. And so for me, it's like, okay, this is information, and now we have to chart a course forward. And it's really hard to do without that reserve study, because otherwise it's just a guess. And similar to guessing is the concept of a homemade reserve study, And I'm not trying to insult anyone who's an engineer or a reserve study professional, which are very rare in the world, who made their own reserve study. But a homemade reserve study to me is, as I say it generically, a problem. Why? Because you may not have the expertise to generate a reserve study. You might not know how much things cost. You might not know how exterior components fit together to keep water out. And when you do things in conformance with the lack of knowledge that you possess or don't possess, you can take on individual liability if you're wrong. And forget the liability issue. It doesn't convince the skeptical owners that they need to contribute more to pay to resolve something. It falls flat on its face. And I've been to many, many meetings with this homemade reserve study, and it's just an instant credibility depleter when you don't have a reserve study that is done by somebody. This is my opinion. I don't sell reserve studies. It's just so much more credible to have a professional reserve study. And they say, we don't trust your reserve study. What do you know about reserve studies? Brian?
Yeah. And so I think that's kind of leads in from that clarity minimizing lawsuits. And we see there that, well, if we don't have a reserve study, maybe the first level of opposition will be like, well, okay, I know John over here. John used to work in finance. I think he knows his way around a spreadsheet. And John might stand up and say, yeah, I can save us some bucks. I'll just do the reserve study myself, right? That's generally how the flow of thought goes. We don't have a reserve study. We don't want to get a reserve study. So why don't we just tap someone who maybe can run a spreadsheet and see what they can do for us? Now, this is the image that pops into my brain is hold my beer and let me figure this out. All right. So hold my beer. If you haven't been around a bunch of 25-year-old guys, generally speaking, a lot of bad decisions are made when you say, hey, do you think I could jump over that thing? And he'll hold my beer. Let me see if I can do it. Not that I have no experience of that. I just heard it from through the grapevine from friends. You know, those are some bad choices that way, some hospital visits. And so when we start to take on that sort of project as an owner, as a board member, I just look at it as it's starting off in the wrong direction. Again, if you want to run your own budget and see, okay, based on what the reserve study says, I want to run my own budget, kind of cross-reference things, totally fine. But what we want to be careful of is now saying we don't want to spend the money on a professional reserve study. Rather, we're going to use one of our own, tap our own people to now make budget recommendations that influence the financials of our associations and how it runs, neglecting the fact that this is a multi-million-dollar not-for-profit real estate corporation. So you're just taking it on. And so where are the problems, right? The problems are, number one, it's just when you pay for the diligence of a reserve professional, you're getting that professional unbiased recommendation from that professional. When I complete a reserve study, I want to complete it in accordance to National Reserve Study standards. Therefore, I have no sort of emotions when it comes to if I have to recommend a special assessment because the association has a large project due this year, or if I'm just making small recommendations for the client. Of course, we feel for the association, but we cannot be biased to make different financial recommendations because our sole purpose is to create a reserve study in accordance to National Reserve Study standards. But in response to the question of, well, we just want to save a few bucks, what we find is that the cost that you're saving is really negligible. Because if you're just deferring a project or you're making a quick little change on the reserve study because you don't want to have to replace that roof next year, most likely that roof is going to go up in cost next year. Some of the inflationary pressures on that roof or potentially some deferred maintenance on that roof, it's going to wipe out any savings that you had by getting a reserve study done. So we're just saying the reserve study cost relative to the components at your property is minor. And then as David already touched on, who are they going to believe, right? Again, you are making a presentation to your owners that they should potentially either stay the same or increase the reserves. Are they going to believe you if things go south? Right? Are they going to blame you if things aren't working out right? Why would you want to take on that liability? And so what are some of the psychological reasons for that, David?
Yeah, authority bias, right? Which is people believe an expert innately. They just do. We do. I do. And having an expert creates credibility for the request for additional money. And I've been to a lot of association meetings where the board has decided we need more money. And it's never been quantified. It's never been reduced to a report. and I'm sitting there, charging a significant amount of money on an hourly basis that probably would have paid for the reserve study that would have likely quelled half of the resistance that we see in the room with just good data. And the other thing is, and this is, I say this a lot, the Dunning-Kruger effect, but, homeowners, and that includes board members, and I'm a homeowner and Brian's a homeowner, we think we're better than we are in topics that are complicated. And we don't always know what it takes to keep a community running. And we often overestimate our understanding of all of the complicated procedures and components and the costs and the timing that would be encapsulated in a reserve study. And so we got to be careful of wanting to be a hero and thinking that it's easier than it is. It doesn't have to be complicated. But again, with water intrusion and building envelope issues and decks and balconies and siding and all these other things, there's a lot of moving pieces. And I would just say it's never quite as simple as we think. But that, again, to me, it's one of the cheapest risk management tools an association that has appreciable responsibilities for infrastructure can invest in. So let's talk about hard to interpret. Is a reserve study hard to interpret, Brian?
Well, again, we're getting to the next level of resistance.
Yeah.
If we don't have a reserve study, fine, we'll do it ourselves. Okay, fine, that doesn't sound like a good idea. Well, if we get a reserve study, we're not going to even understand what it says. We're just going to put it on the shelf because it's too hard to interpret. But when we put a reserve study together, as you can see on the next slide, this is how we try to present all the data so that it can be digested in a short time frame. So this is a lot of numbers, but I can truly walk you through it in less than 3 minutes. So on the front of our reserve study, you're going to see we have the starting balance for this association, right? This hypothetical association. That's how much money they have in reserves. Their fully funded reserve balance is $3.6 million. So you go, whoa, that sounds like a big number. We divide those two numbers together and we see that this association is 16% funded. So they're in the red. Okay, so right now I've already found out that the association has this much money. The fully funded balance or the accumulated value of deterioration is this 3.6 in this particular case. Therefore, currently their risk levels or their financial health levels are lower. Their risk is high and their health for financials is low. Okay, so then what do we do with that? Well, based on the reserve study recommendations, we are saying transfer it into the reserve account about $670,000. Okay, that's the data point that we need to go for. And so then the question will be, well, okay, what are we doing now? Well, you can see in the bottom of the gray box right there, it says the most recent annual reserve transfer rate is $669,000. Okay, so I've tried to say there, based on all the data, this property had, let's just say, hundreds and hundreds of components, but we were able to distill all the information onto one page by saying, here's how much money the association has. So here's their starting point. Okay. Then we're able to say, why? Why do they need money? Well, based on the accumulated value deterioration for this association, they have about $3.6 million of accumulated deterioration. Therefore, currently, they're at a lower percent funded, meaning they currently don't have funding. However, the road that they need to take, the path that they need to take, the directions they need to follow are to just stay the course, increase slightly their reserve transfers, and they're going to be in a good position, right? So if that's something that you're afraid of presenting at a board meeting, we are able to explain this very quickly. Of course, there's always going to be someone who's available to explain that to you. If you're ever concerned or confused, give me a quick call, email. We can make a very quick video that explains your data, just like I did here, very briefly. But then you might get a question that says, well, what's the percent funded? And so let me show you how we want to interpret the percent funded on the next slide. Percent funded is a way for us to assess the financial health of the association. So on that last slide you saw, it was 16.7% funded. It might sound scary, but the goal of the reserve study is not to create some sort of morality or judgment, moral judgment on the association or the board or how they did things. Rather, we're just saying currently, here's where you're at today, okay? So the percent funded is just a statistical tool that we utilize to show current financial health. So what we have found is that when associations are at 30% funded and below, statistically speaking, they're at a higher risk of special assessment risks. Whereas when you are at 70% funded and above, that risk drops to less than 1% to have those same sort of risks. However, this is not a moral judgment. So when I go to the doctor, I use this example and I get my blood pressure checked. If I'm a little bit over the normal range, let's say I'm like 130 over 100 or something like that, is that a moral judgment on my health? Or is it potentially I had too much coffee that morning, or maybe you need to go running a bit more, something like that. It is not a moral judgment that I'm a good or bad person. It's just that I need to make some maybe minor adjustments or some tweaks because I'm currently in a higher risk or elevated risk range. The same thing is with your percent funded. Don't get distracted by, hey, we're poorly funded or well-funded. Well-funded being, hey, we don't have to do anything. We're so good. Don't worry about it. Or we're poorly funded. I'm so embarrassed. I can't present this data. Rather, just understand if you're concerned or you're confused about what this all means. It's a simple email and it can be explained for you very clearly so that if you start to feel that fear of presenting this at an annual meeting, we can give you the really quick tools or the really quick phrases that help explain that so that it's no longer hard to interpret. It's no longer confusing. It's just very simple data.
I've never heard anyone explain being 16% funded so eloquently so that people leave with the right measure of concern for the future, but not hopelessness and antagonism. And that's what it's all about, right? Which is giving adults good information, credible information, and including them in this decision that the community will ultimately have to make now and in the future. One of the things that comes up to me a lot, and I'm sure it does to Brian, is this reserve study numbers are too expensive, right? We understand it, but there's no way we can fund that. And the genesis of this class came from a class we were teaching on a Saturday somewhere in Colorado, and the sincere board member who was a little frustrated piped up and said, I don't know why you'd give us these numbers. We don't have the money. We'll never have the money. We're never going to fund in accordance with the study. So why bother? Somebody may lose their home. Brian's going to re-anchor that effectively.
Right. And this reminds me of me I don't like going to the doctor. So my wife has to generally remind me to.
Let me just say, Brian's response to that real time was, go ahead, Brian.
Yeah. So it is true. There's been times where I have like a fever or something like that. And I say, hey, Steph, which is my wife, I'm just going to wait this one out. I think I'll be okay because I don't want to pay the copay. I think I'll be fine. I think I can take some ibuprofen. And so what I'm essentially saying is like, I prefer not to go to the doctor. If I'm actually having like appendicitis, we'll deal with it at that point. However, that's a very poor way of structuring that problem, right? If I would just go to the doctor now, see if I can take some antibiotics or see if I need to go do some more preventative measures, I'm going to save myself a lot of money because a simple doctor visit is going to be much cheaper than a trip to the urgent care. Not that I have any experience having to wait until 12 o'clock at night to go to the urgent care. It's just I found out that bill is not cheap, right? So we want to think through this. It is something that you may say, now this looks too expensive. We can't worry about it. So I'm just going to defer it. But unfortunately, that's not going to be helpful whatsoever. And so if you get that pushback, okay, we don't want to reserve say, okay, well, you need to get one. Okay, well, we'll do it ourselves. Well, that's not the right choice to do. Okay, well, fine. Even if we get it, it doesn't make any sense. I don't understand. It's very cumbersome. Okay, fine. But the numbers don't make any sense. It's just too expensive, right? We're trying to track the following arguments you're going to get. Well, let me remind the board members and the owners that funding your reserves is not too expensive, right? As David mentioned, it's anchoring. If you think your reserve transfers per month should be $100 a month, for example, but they really should be like $300 per month, we have to re-anchor that. And so one way I have found to be helpful for re-anchoring that is just looking at how much does it cost per day for an owner that lives in your property. And what we found is that it's relatively affordable depending on what you're comparing it to. So I went to Starbucks the other day. I got a small cup of drip coffee and it was about $3.50 to get a small cup of drip coffee from Starbucks. And so interestingly, what we found is that for an average well-funded or a well-funded association that can take care of their association's assets on an ongoing basis, it's about $3 to $5 per day per unit, $3 to $5 per day per unit. And so the argument here then is, look, We're not saying give up your cup of coffee and just put it into reserves. I understand a cup of coffee gives you that immediate joy. However, we're saying that if you have an owner that says, we can't afford this, the response back should be, well, we can, just we don't want to, right? And that's a different conversation. We just don't want to afford this. It is something that we can put money into. We can make a difference in our reserves. We can put our feet one foot in front of the other and actually go towards a positive direction. We just have to change the way that we look at the problem. It is not too expensive. It's just that we don't want to spend the money. So the thing that we also then need to keep in mind is if it's too expensive today, it's going to be much more expensive next year. And so what are we seeing then from a cost basis for your associations? Well, there's two factors that we have to be aware of whenever we push a project aside or defer a project's replacement. One of them is going to be just the scope of work increases over time. So if we have like a minor painting and repair project, that might turn into a full replacement project. So we have a $2 square foot project moving to about $20 to $25 a square foot. So massive cost increase due to deferring a project, a simple project that's going to cost the association, all the owners, a lot of money. Additionally, the longer that we wait to complete a project, inflation is now going to impact the cost of that project. And so this is a really helpful index that I look at. It's the Mortenson Construction Cost Index. And as you can see, in 2025 alone, we experienced about a 7.5% increase in construction materials. So this is just an index, meaning it's not exactly your association's, whatever it may be, but it's helpful to remember for the Colorado area and Denver particularly. And this, they also track nationally if you want to look on their website. It's just helpful to see, wow, costs are increasing. And you can see that bump from 2020 to 2021. I mean, things are really going up in price. So if, again, the response is, it's too expensive, we can't afford it, well, we have to make a choice because it's only going to be more expensive the longer that we wait.
Yeah, and the response might be, and we wouldn't say it necessarily this bluntly, but the project determines the price. The price will be paid. And when we talk about it's too expensive, we're arguing with reality because the real estate deteriorates on a pretty predictable schedule. And when we argue with reality, we usually lose, right? So that, it's too expensive is just a fantasy. It is what it is. And I wouldn't say that either in a public meeting, but we have to be aware that the project will determine the price, and that price will be paid for people to live in these homes. And to Brian's way of talking about this, we don't need to win today. We don't need to win this year. We just have to start. And the psychology is loss aversion, right? People feel losses twice as acutely as they feel equivalent gains. All of us, not every human on earth, but as a general rule, we are much more attuned to feeling loss acutely than we are to feeling gain. And we also put off things in the future, right? Whether it's our health, our teeth, car payment, our retirement. We want immediate savings over future cost savings, right? And you look at associations and you look at the federal government, we all want lower taxes, we all want more services, and that's just mathematically impossible. So this idea of how can we save $5 this year? Well, you could, but it might be $7.50 the following year that you'll have to pay with the construction cost index and the scope of the project creeping due to Band-Aids. And it's pretty common that boards, humans, save money by doing repairs, right? And that's usually the life cycle of any component that has the ability to be repaired. Let's do the repairs. Brian?
Right, exactly. Okay, we've come to the reality. These are the costs. These are what they are. We just heard that we can't defer it or we can't push it aside because it's just going to get worse and more expensive. We're seeing that costs aren't slowing down. So can we just do it in pieces, or can we just do some Band-Aids and some minor repairs because we just don't have the money? We can't do this, and we can't potentially, or again, we don't want to because we're afraid of our board meeting. We're afraid of our annual meeting, of what's going to happen. So I understand this again, right? We're saying these things not from an ivory tower. We're saying these things because we've seen these in real time during board meetings where we know how hard and potentially stressful it can be. So again, we're trying to give you the answers so that when you're faced with these sorts of dilemmas, how do you respond in an effective way? So again, if the question then says, okay, well, can't we just repair some of these things or phase these things over time? Won't that just be a better way of doing it? Can we just save some money that way? If you go back, actually, no, to that one right there.
Okay.
This is helpful for you to think about as far as when you get that question visually, can we just repair over time? So when we get our percent funded, the math behind it, as I showed you on that previous slide, was we take what do you have in your reserves as of the fiscal year start date, divide it by the fully funded balance, which is the accumulated value of deterioration. So the accumulated value of deterioration or the fully funded balance, this is how the math works, okay? So if we just replace the component this year, it is 1 year old. And if we have a component that should last 10 years and it currently costs $10,000, in order to be keeping pace with the rate of deterioration or 100% funding this particular component in year one, we should have about $1,000 in reserves to be keeping pace with that rate of deterioration. So as you can see, it matches the rate of deterioration as the years progress. So in year 10, we say, okay, we don't want to spend the money. Rather, we're just going to repair it. So we spend maybe, I don't know, $500. We're just going to repair it. $500. The next year, $500. Well, now we actually still need to replace this component, but we've already spent an additional $1,000 just to repair to keep it going by, right? Just to keep it going, excuse me. So in year 12, we still have to pay the potentially $10,000, but we've already put in an additional $1,000. So we've increased the total cost of the project because we've just band-aided it over time. But remember, I showed you in a few slides ago, inflation is impacting all of these costs on the association's property. So we've got potentially even greater than the money that we've said that we were going to spend, because now it's no longer $10,000. It could be $11,000 or $12,000 we've already spent, an additional $1,000. As you can see, we're just spending more money for the same result. Spending the money, completing projects on time is actually going to be the best way for the association to actually save as much money as they can, not deferring them, not pushing them down the line.
And so, they say, can we do temporary repairs? It's too much to fix all at once. And at some point, it just has to be replaced. And, this constant cycle of band-aiding kicks the can down the road. The project gets more expensive. The project could increase in scope due to deterioration as a result of not being proactive. And sometimes, these Band-Aids are much more expensive. When we're going past the estimated useful life of the component, it sometimes gets very expensive just to Band-Aid. And it's understandable because when we've sunk money into the repairs, we don't want to say, oh, okay, well, all of that was a waste and we just need to tear off the roof or what have you. But that's the reality. Once we've sunk those repairs, it doesn't really change the reality that we face on the ground, which is we can't keep throwing good money after bad. Let's bite the bullet and do this replacement. Now, status quo bias, right? People like things not to change, and that's managers, lawyers, board members, homeowners. And these projects, these large capital replacement projects are scary. They can be risky. They can be disruptive to the community. So we just have to understand that people may resist the change of the disruption and all of the parking inconveniences, depending on what it is. We prefer things that are familiar, and Band-Aiding can be familiar. It just may not be cost effective. You talked a little bit about losing to construction costs, but there's also inflation, right? And when people talk about this, they say accurately, I can invest my money better than the association can. Or the alternative is, we'll just wait till the thing needs to be replaced and just call me and I'll write the check.
Right. So again, you can see these are the questions that you get, right? We've already answered this. We've already answered the cost issues. Okay, fine. I still don't want to give money to the association because I know I can do better than the association can. The thing that we have to think about is that when we chose to live within an association, we now have an obligation to pay for our fair share of the usage of our assets while we live at that property. Therefore, if potentially you can get special assessed and you can handle it, are you sure your neighbor can? Because the obligation that you have when you chose to live within the association is to pay for your fair share. Also keep in mind that it's going to potentially cost money to then get the money in the first place. You have to have a vote. You have to get other people involved, particularly if you can't collect on those fees because some people can't afford it. It's going to now potentially cause more problems, more delays, could cause other issues that we're not aware of at the time we make our choice. And then again, remember, if we can't just write the check on time to get that project done, we have to maybe wait a year or wait for the next annual meeting to make this choice. We're still losing out. We're still losing time. In Colorado, for example, we can't just do a project, depending on what it is, in the dead of winter. You have to wait for the next summer to potentially do it. So we're just losing out. Another thing to keep in mind is for your owners, the cheapest and most equitable and fairest way to run your association's finances for the reserves are just going to be ongoing reserve transfers. So you can see here, I have reserve transfers on the left, a special assessment in the middle, and then a loan funding option on the farthest right. Even with 1% annual compounding interest, the association can save about $20,000 just with reserve transfers. And also keep in mind, that's over a 15-year time period. So not every single owner even has to pay the total 15 years, right? Some owners may move in, move out. So it's a much cheaper, affordable way of doing it. The $250,000 would be a special assessment. So one set of owners has to pay for all of that. And a loan, of course, is going to then cost the association more money over potentially a 7 or 6 year period, depending on what the loan deal pans out to be, because you have to pay the privilege of borrowing that money. So again, cheapest and most equitable way. Again, you may be able to manage your association's finances, or manage your own finances better than the association. But wouldn't you just also like to save money too, like not putting more money into the association than you have to? But the best way to do that is just going to be reserve transfers. But then they'll say to me, as you can see on the next slide, well, how does your reserve study help me? Because you just told me inflation is going to change from year to year. So all the numbers on your reserve study are going to be wrong next year. And we say yes. And that's why we recommend annually updating your reserve study. Because if you wait just 3 years to update your reserve study relative to an association who's updating it every year, the association, by waiting 3 years, increases their special assessment risk by about 28%. If you wait 5 years to update your reserve study, you've now increased your risk of special assessment by 35%. Why is that? Well, because again, all the costs on your reserve study are going to be current costs, current data. We are calling roofing vendors, calling all the vendors for your property, getting the quotes, getting the costs in real time for your association's assets. Those bids for those items are generally 15 to 30 days, potentially, if that. They're good for that long. So 3 years down the line, those numbers are totally out the window.
Psychology is the illusion of control. When someone says, just tell me when I need to write the check and I'll write it. Those people never write the check, not ever, in my experience. And it costs money to raise money as an association. And so, we have to understand that people think they're experts in finances, and there are people who are CPAs or very good with their money. But then the conversation shifts to, but do you trust your neighbors to pay? Because if they don't, you're going to end up holding the bag as the person who can control their money. So we have to be aware of that. And as we reduce our trust, either by a homemade reserve study or not a clear reserve study or inadequate conversations with our owners, we find that the cooperation falls off an absolute cliff. And there's documented psychological studies for why that is. And part of this concept that we're talking about is that when everyone votes for their short-term self-interest, they can destroy the community's viability. And that's referred to as the tragedy of the commons, where we're all just worried about ourselves right now, and we don't fund the reserves, and then we find out that the association is in too deep a hole that it can effectively dig itself out of. Give to future owners is one of the most compelling arguments, I think, that we can make in reframing the issue of what reserve funds are actually for. And I call it the green banana syndrome, which is when someone or a group of owners say, I don't want to pay for future owners to use the elevator that we're about to pay to refurbish. I don't even buy green bananas because I may not be alive to eat them when they ripen. And that's a George Burns bit from years ago. But why should we pay for the benefit of future owners? We won't be here when the roof needs to be replaced.
And this response that we need to have to that sort of problem is reframing the question, or reframing the way that we look at reserve studies. We never say this is for the future, because again, we're going to have that green bananas issue. Rather, we want to frame the conversation as your reserves are paying for your usage while you live at the association. You're paying for the here and now, the ongoing deterioration of the association's components while you live here. You're not paying for someone else in the future. Rather, you're utilizing these components while you live here. Therefore, you have an obligation to pay for your fair share of these components while you live at the property.
Yeah. And that's just basically saying you're wearing it out now. And if you ever plan to sell, you're going to have a problem. We'll talk about impact on resale. But the psychology is hyperbolic discounting, which is and I talked about temporal discounting, but hyperbolic is a dramatic decline in interest depending on how far out the future reward is. Pretty well documented in psychology. Let's talk about the impact at resale, Brian, and we'll take some questions.
Excellent.
I'll move out before we special assess. Maybe you won't. You might move out, but you probably won't sell.
Right. So, I mean, at least now we're getting to the kind of the final end game here of, okay, fine. I put my hands up. I'll get out of here. I don't want to be a part of this. I just don't want to pay. The thing is, we now have to be aware that more and more entities, institutions, other than just your HOA, are now interested in the association's finances. So it reminds me of 15 years ago, the response we got when we put roofs in Colorado in the reserve study. The response would be, well, we're just going to wait for the next hailstorm. Then that will take care of that, right? We won't fund for it. And these were legitimate responses I received. What we're finding is that more institutions are really interested. In fact, the largest kind of underwriter, which helps back most of the loans that occur in the United States, are now even putting guidelines in as far as what kind of deals they're going to take. Some of their guidelines for underwriting specific deals include the specific guidelines that a reserve study must be completed within at least 3 years of the time of the deal. A reserve study must be prepared by an independent person like a reserve specialist. And then that the reserve study must comment favorably on the age and condition of the property. Also, we've found that lower property values occur when an association is poorly funded. So it could be correlation and causation, right? Those things. But if you go to a well-funded community, most likely the things, the items, the aesthetics of the association are going to be in better condition because you're not having to defer, you're not having to wait. When those turbulent periods occur where they have heavy expenses, the association is able to fund for those replacements rather than just deferring or band-aiding or whatever it may be. So we do see an impact on the resale value of the homes. A well-funded association has about a 12% increase in the resale value because generally speaking, things are taken care of. Generally, there's less rumors of special assessments, and it's going to be a much smoother process for the association.
So to conclude, it's important business. It's worth doing properly. We don't have to win today. And, to the board members on the call that are concerned about rolling out bad news, an unsatisfactory or scary reserve study, talk to your manager, talk to your attorney if you need to. But it's information that the homeowners are entitled to get and I think should morally have. And that doesn't make it your fault. If we ask owners to contribute more to reserves and they reject that, it's not a failure of you. It often will improve the association's legal position if people come back and want to make arguments that we didn't properly maintain something. Well, we couldn't because you didn't fund the corporation. And that's what I mean by being mindful of your emotional investments, which is board members have often the first look at the reserve study. They probably have a lot more context, hopefully, than the regular homeowner would have. And there's this stress, understandably, that comes with worrying about how are you going to start to make these reserve fund transfers. This is not your sole problem to solve. It's a community conversation. And we give owners the good information, access to the professionals, and they get to decide whether they want to fund it or not, depending on your state's laws and your governing documents. And if they choose not to, it's not your fault.